Hello and welcome to our study on the faith, failings, and mercy. We're currently tackling the Old Testament character of Sarah. A few things I want to mention about Sarah and really many of the other characters we're going to study in this study. The first, or the thing that applies to all of, or many of them, is that they are secondary characters. So the biblical story is intending to tell the story of Sarah's husband, Abraham. So the focus is on Abraham. So Sarah's portion of the story is told primarily in relation to Abraham. We don't hear independent Sarah stories so much as we hear Sarah stories as they relate to Abraham. That's important as we look at, or knowing that, paying attention to that is important as we look at many of these Old Testament characters. These Old Testament characters that we're studying have gaps in their story, big gaps in their story, and that's because they aren't the primary character. So we spend some time as we read through what bits and pieces we have of their story. We can spend some time using our imagination to try and flesh out the story, if you will. And we can do that to our heart's content, but we also have to remember that what we actually have, what we actually know of the story, is only the words that are recorded in the scriptures. So we have to kind of make a distinction between this is what we know, this is what's recorded in the scripture, and this is what we think might have been happening in that character's life, in their emotions and in their thoughts, based on what's recorded in the scriptures. But we do have to kind of make that distinction because there's kind of first level truths about the character that's recorded in the scriptures, and then there's second level truths or things that we think we might know based on the scriptures. So with that caveat, I want to talk more specifically about Sarah today. A few interesting things to note. Sarah's life is not easy. She starts out with a different name, Sarai, and she marries a man, Abraham, who worships a different God than she does and has been what do I want to say, has been dedicated to wandering, to traveling in worship of this God. So she becomes nomadic. She may have been previously with her previous family, but it doesn't sound that way. She becomes nomadic with Abraham. And in that nomadic time, there's two stories, one that shows up early in her life and one that shows up late in her life, where they wander into what is potentially hostile territory. And in this hostile territory, her husband, in his infinite wisdom, passes her off as his sister. So we hear this story happening twice, where Abraham tells the leader of the territory that they're in that this is his sister, so that he and his family won't be attacked over her beauty, and instead then the local leader of that area can just take Sarah into his harem. So at least twice in her life, she's passed off as Abraham's sister, and she is taken into the harem of the king or the leader of the local area, the local territory, and she's expected to do everything that any other wife or concubine in the harem is expected to do. So we have this kind of difficult situation here, this kind of difficult life where she's being asked or told, we don't know, by her husband to give her body up for the sake of keeping the family safe. We don't hear her response or reaction to that. The scriptures does not tell us her response or reaction. It just tells us that this happened and they went and did it. It also does tell us, though, that in both cases, God rescued her from it. So we see in these sections, clock Sorry, my clock was ringing there in the background, so I paused us for just a minute. We see in these sections then that Sarah is being used physically for the safety of the family or the larger group of people that Abraham is responsible for. Again, we don't hear her reaction, but I would expect that this isn't something that she particularly appreciates as part of her role as Abraham's wife. Sarah is most famous, of course, for being the mother of Isaac. She gives birth to Isaac late in life as part of a promise that God made to Abraham early in Abraham's life. Now, it's worth noting that the promise was made specifically to Abraham, and it does not mention that Sarah, or Sarai at the time the first promise was made, was necessarily going to be the mother of this child. It just mentions that Abraham is going to have descendants as numerous as the sands on the shore or the stars in the sky. So the early promise, the first promise, does not mention Sarah at all, which perhaps explains why when Sarah becomes barren, she makes a choice to have her slave girl Hagar sleep with her husband and then have a child in that way. Now we have to set aside some of our modern sensibilities around that piece of the story, because of course none of us, at least I certainly hope none of us, would condone slavery or be slaveholders in any way. So that's a piece of the story that was common in that time, but of course is not common in our time. Another piece of the story that we kind of have to set aside our modern sensibilities about is this idea that if a slave girl were to have a child with one's husband, then that child could be considered the child of the mistress, the mistress of the household, of the owner of the slave. We see this a number of times in biblical literature. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying that that was part of the cultural expectations of the time. So, Hagar and Abraham have a child. That child is named Ishmael, and it is only after Ishmael's birth that God comes back and gives the promise of a son to Isaac again, and this time makes it clear that Sarah is to be the mother. So previously it was just a promise to Abraham. Now after Ishmael is born, later on God comes back in the form of one of three men who stop by Abraham's tents, by the oaks of Mamre, and God makes it clear that Sarah will be the mother of the child. And Sarah, of course, laughs derisively at that because she has, as is put, gone past the way of women. She is too old to have children. She does not expect this promise to be kept. I want to back up a little bit and talk about Sarah's relationship with Hagar, the slave girl, because it's very ugly. So I'm telling the story today from Sarah's perspective. Our next character I think that we're going to look at is Hagar, so we'll hear more of the story a bit from Hagar's perspective next month. But from Sarah's perspective, she has a child now, Ishmael, which according to the practice of the time, whether we like it or not, according to the practice of the time, was considered her child because it was born of her slave girl and her husband. And so her expectation then would be that this child would be hers, raised by her, etc. And she finds that her slave girl, Hagar, is lording it over her or making it clear that she's somehow superior because she could have a baby and Sarah could not. And so Sarah begins abusing her. And we hear some stories of horrific abuse of Hagar. She gets kicked out twice in the stories. She and the child are kicked out. In one case, they come back, and in another case, they do not. But we hear of Hagar, or of Sarah abusing Hagar. Sarah started this whole thing with saying, "Hey, you go have a baby with my husband." Hagar, of course, being a slave girl, didn't have the freedom to say no to that. And then once the baby is born, I think we're expected really to sympathize with Sarah because, after all, her slave girl was looking down on her. But my sympathies rest with poor Hagar, who was forced to have sex with a man that we don't know if she wanted to or not, but it's clear that she was told to and had to do it, is forced to have a baby with that man and is expected to give that child up to her mistress as her mistress's child, and then is abused for having done exactly what she was told, and is kicked out. She comes back and then again gets kicked out by Sarah later. And so Sarah's a very complicated character. We see places where Sarah's autonomy is taken away by her husband. We see places where Sarah takes away somebody else's autonomy, Hagar's autonomy, through her use of Hagar. And at the end of it all, at the end of all of this story, the piece that holds the Sarah and kind of Hagar story together is God is faithful to God's promise. So even though Sarah's story is complicated, even though certainly there are times in Sarah's story where she is acting in ways that we would consider completely unacceptable, and she makes Hagar's life and Ishmael's life absolutely miserable, God is still faithful to her. And so we see in the story of Sarah, we see God being faithful even in the midst of the lack of trust and the sinful nature of humanity. Sarah eventually, of course, gives birth to Isaac. And at that time, we're told that Sarah laughs with joy. So first she laughs derisively by the oaks of Mamre when she overhears that she's supposed to give birth to a child. But when she actually gives birth to Isaac, we hear that she laughs with joy. And then we hear that she lives out to the end of her days. So really the stories that we have of Sarah are the stories of her marrying Abraham, her being given over to, I believe it's the Pharaoh the first time, as a concubine, her name being changed, the promise of a child, not just the promise to Abraham, which happened earlier, but the promise of a child to Abraham and Sarah, her conniving to get a child through Hagar, her being given again, this time to a king, as a concubine, and the eventual birth of Isaac and everything that happens in the midst of that. So that's kind of the Sarah saga. Next week, the video will be discussion questions about Sarah and what do we do with all of this. So I'll post those. Those are just for your thinking and your thoughts. And, that'll end the video series. But of course, we also offer the Zoom gathering at the end of this video series for Sarah. And that will be July 7th at 6 p.m. Central Time. And we will get together with anybody that's interested, and we'll talk some more about Sarah and some more about the discussion questions and things like that. So again, with these videos, you can watch one of them, you can watch all of them, you can participate at whatever level you want. So with the discussion questions, maybe you just want to think about those on your own, or if you want to be part of the Zoom conversation, that Zoom link will be posted with the discussion questions next week. Have a great and wonderful week, and I will be back with another video next week. God bless all.